I'm Taylor Phillips and super happy to be here presenting this work to you all today. Excited for questions. I'm used to folks asking questions, throughout. I know that's not quite what we do at SPSP. So if you do have questions during, feel free to put it in the chat. I've got that open and I can kind of keep an eye and see if I can clarify anything as we go along. Dallas will be moving to Rice University this fall. I'm at NYU Stern and excited to present this. Our kind of main question here, I feel like I'm just listening to Mina's talk, that's really on my mind. So Mina is making a nice point about what are current sort of models and theories and approaches to intergroup dynamics and intergroup relations. And Sora and I had this kind of similar, well, wait a minute, like what are our current approaches to understanding discrimination? What are those missing? And so the impetus for this project really came from a couple of summers ago during the protest against George Floyd's murder. Organizations, businesses, entities that normally didn't seem to care much about racial inequality really came out and said, hey, we're going to do something about this. We're going to stop discrimination. We're going to try to help fix racial inequality. Of course, not all at once. There's a lot of follow-up research on this to see how committed these statements really were. So how can we avoid this kind of crimes against, in Mina's talk, discrimination against this kind of negative, this disadvantage against disadvantaged or marginalized groups. But what the research shows is that a lot of race inequality, and particularly in organizations, stems not only from prejudice discrimination against, which is true and important, but it also comes from the in-group love side of things. Favoritism towards those who look similar, feel similar, are connected to dominant group members. So a lot of discrimination in hiring is actually about this favoritism, this in-group love side, rather than a prejudice against. Now, again, both are happening. But what's really interesting to us is if we look in our literature on perceived discrimination, attributions to discrimination, lots and lots of really good, helpful research for when it is people notice discrimination, what counts as discrimination. But this is overwhelmingly couched in terms of victims of discrimination, which completely misses the fact that there are also beneficiaries of discrimination. And so if there's like one point that I can leave you with today, other than that I just got a new computer, I would like this to be that main point, is that when we're thinking about studying discrimination, how people perceive it, how they understand it, we seem to only be looking at one side of that process, the victim experience. And I'm not saying we shouldn't study, that's incredibly important to notice when people feel victimized, to notice when people notice other victims, but anytime there's an instance of discrimination, there's also a beneficiary. That's often how we know discrimination occurred, right? Is that the dominant group member gets the job or gets selected or gets the better treatment as compared to the subordinate or marginalized group member. And so that's what we kind of wanted to explore. And so I'll show you a couple of pieces of this, sort of what I'm calling my preamble. So in a paper that just came out, it's in press online. It's not even the official proofs version yet, but if you are interested, you can take a look. It's already online in an early version. So again, with Sora Jun and with PhD student Angela Shakiri, what we did is we first went into the scientific literature. So we looked at papers in top psychology journals, sociology, where there's a lot of race. Also in this project, we looked at gender inequity. So sociology has a lot of that, obviously psychology, and also management or organizational behavior research. And we pulled every article that looked at some sort of organizational inequity in race or gender from 2000 to 2020. So that's a lot. That's a lot of paper. That's a big chunk of time. And then we coded these articles for what frame of emphasis they tended to use. So for example, you could use a disadvantage or kind of victim-focused frame. So you're thinking about discrimination and you're thinking about racial inequity. You're really emphasizing the disadvantaged or the marginalized groups. You could use an advantaged or a favoring frame. So you could think about, oh, well, actually whites are benefiting from privileges. Whites are benefiting from discrimination. Dominant groups are getting extra help, are getting something above and beyond what they're would otherwise be expected to get. Or you could use both frames, but what we find, and clearly, I think it's obvious to this group probably, we had a hypothesis of what we'd find, but these numbers surprised us. We thought we'd certainly get a little more emphasis on the advantaging or favoring frame side, given that our science, right, in-group love, out-group hate, we know this is what happens in intergroup dynamics. We know that in-group love drives a lot of things similar to out-group hate, but that these are somewhat different processes. And yet, in our research about actual race and gender inequity that's happening in the world, we overwhelmingly are focusing on the out-group hate side of things. Again, not saying that we shouldn't focus on that, that's important, but what are we missing? What are we missing in terms of mechanisms, in terms of potential interventions, if we're not looking at how advantage also plays a role? So that's what we find in this annals piece. If you're interested, we have a lot more detail there. It's like a big kind of literature review sort of piece. But this was sort of our inspiration for the studies that I want to present to you today, is this kind of, well, we know from more applied literature that in-group love, in-group favoritism, advantage towards dominant groups drives a lot of inequity. And yet, most of our perceived discrimination, basically all of our perceived discrimination, attribution to discrimination literature, completely neglects that side of things. We seem to act as if discrimination only creates victims, but it does not. It also creates beneficiaries. So what happens? Do people know that? What's going on with that? So what we started out with is kind of a semi-qualitative approach. So we just asked a set of business school students in this case, what does discrimination mean to you? Just trying to see what how they define it. And we found that these lay definitions overwhelmingly reflected the disfavoring frame. So I'll just give you, if you can kind of see my arrow here, a couple of examples at the top. So disfavoring or disadvantage frame, when your identity, race, religion, gender, ethnicity is used against you to disadvantage you. So that one's pretty clear. It's talking about a disadvantage, a barrier to a marginalized group. Favoring or an advantage frame, discrimination is giving one person an unfair advantage or a preference due to factors they cannot control. So this person is actually noticing, oh, like there's a beneficiary side of discrimination. And then sometimes people use no frame. Someone's judged by status, appearance, background instead of their skill sets. So kind of not emphasizing advantage or disadvantage one side or the other. So we had two raters who are naive to hypotheses code this, and this is what we found. Overwhelmingly, the disfavoring frame was used. Also, we see a lot of no frames being used in defining discrimination. But here, only 5% of responses used any kind of favoring frame language whatsoever. So people just don't seem to be, lay people don't seem to be thinking about discrimination in terms of the beneficiary or advantage side. They seem to be very focused on disadvantage itself. Now, one question could be, well, is this kind of a semantic thing, discrimination, disfit, like maybe there's something going on there. So we took a slightly different approach. This time we went to employed adults, and we just described sometimes there's unfair hiring decisions out there. They could be based on identity or group. Have you ever observed, experienced, or heard of something like this happening? So we don't say the word discrimination anywhere, and we just ask them to kind of tell us about that. And again, I'll show you a couple of examples. So here's a disfavoring frame example. A friend of mine was pretty qualified to get the job. She had both the education and experience, but they wanted to hire a male instead. They were biased against women, right? So very disfavoring out-group hate kind of emphasis. Here, I work in a library that has more women than men working in it. We had a candidate that was weighted more favorably because he identified as male. So an emphasis instead on this advantaging or this favoring side. And again, it's a little different from the data I showed you from lay definitions of discrimination, but the pattern overall is the same. We're seeing way less favoring framing as compared to responses that use disfavoring framing. So it seems that lay people, at least, are conceptualizing discrimination, unfair hiring practices with an emphasis on not only the victim, but on a disadvantaging mechanism, that's sort of their explanation for what's going on. We started to move into, okay, can we capture this experimentally? Is it just something about what's easier to recall? What's going on here? So we capitalized on the fact that employee fit is often used as a justification, a sort of a way to launder discriminatory actions and preferences. And so we kind of use this in our experimental designs. People enter this hiring scenario, lots of detail about the company, et cetera, but here's kind of the key elements. They learned that it was a close call between two candidates. Sometimes we use Jake and Melissa. Sometimes we use Alex and Taylor, because it turns out those are very gender neutral names, things like this. Half the people saw the favoring frame condition. The bosses always felt men fit in better with the team culture. And so Jake gets selected. The other half of participants saw the disfavoring frame. The bosses always felt women fit in worse. And so Jake gets selected. So notice the outcome is the exact same. If women fit in worse, or if men fit in better, whichever logic you're choosing, Jake gets picked and Melissa gets declined, right? But which way we kind of emphasize this mechanism or how we framed it, we're curious if people were able to recognize the similarity or the symmetry in those outcomes. Okay, so took a stimulus sampling approach. I'm a big fan of that. We did this study twice. So first one about 1,000 people, second one pre-registered about 1,000 people replication. Race, sex, LGBT status, some silly things like club affiliation, which sports team you're into, right? So a wide variety of sort of group memberships here to test this out. And here's what we found. So I'm putting multiple DVs on the same graph here for time. We asked people how fair the decision was with a 6-item fairness scale. They found the favoring frame decisions to be more fair. We asked how positive or negative the intentions of the decision maker or the boss were. Found that the favoring framed intentions were way more, the intentions were perceived as way more positive. And we asked if this counted as discrimination. Like, is this a discriminatory decision? Could you attribute this to discrimination? So an attributions to discrimination scale. And again, we find that favoring is less likely to be seen as discriminatory. So it's the exact same situation. Jake gets the job, either because he's preferred because he's a male or because the woman is dispreferred because she's female. Same exact situation. And yet, when we focus on the beneficiary side, this kind of favoring explanation, people don't see this as discriminatory. They don't see it as discriminatory as compared to the more disfavoring frame. They see it as more fair, more acceptable, better intended, and therefore less discriminatory. Sometimes people ask, so in stimulus sampling, right, we're using random effects to look across domains and kind of put all that together, but it's also interesting to split these out. So here's an example of kind of splitting out within each decision frame. So you see the mean level of does this count as discrimination or not, shifting across different categories. But we see that gap between the favoring and the disfavoring showing up fairly consistently. One spot where it tends to be weaker, and in the paper we talk more about this, is in the race comparison between Black and white. So when the white person was picked because white people fit better, or when the Black person was not picked because Black people fit worse, people seem to see those as a little more similar. And yet we don't think it's something about being sensitive to race per se, because right here, we also tested race with an Asian versus white setup. So an Asian candidate was disfavored. I should also mention here that we fully counterbalanced all of this. So I'm giving the traditional discrimination examples, but we also had a full version of this in which people saw the white person be disfavored because they were white, and the Asian person favored because they were Asian. So we fully flipped all of this. That does move the mean of if people think something counts as discrimination or not, but it does not change, it does not affect, does not moderate this framing effect. And as I mentioned, this seems to be going through perceived intention. So basically favoring someone, they fit better, I just like them more. People see that as more positively intended, and we know especially in Western morality, intentions are really quite core to what people see as fair, good, bad, unfair. So once we see those more positive intentions, people are less willing to attribute discrimination, even though it's a clearly discriminatory event. People often ask about really cool moderators, and we were excited about this because, again, based on our literature, you'd think this stuff might moderate it. None of these things moderate this effect at all, which I guess is a cool thing in science when you get an effect that's quite strong. It also became frustrating because how do we fix this? How do we turn it off? I'll return to that in a second. I already showed you across domain. It's just moving the mean. It's not really moderating the framing effect. The counterbalance, if we change, if it's a dominant group getting the job versus if it's the marginalized group getting the job, not changing the framing effect. Legal status, so if it's a legally protected category, or if it's just a sports team you prefer, that's not moderating the effect. Participants' own group membership. So maybe marginalized group members are more sensitive to the fact that discrimination involves both favoring and disfavoring mechanisms. No, we aren't seeing that. So it seems to be fairly robust across these groups. Next, we move to experts. Maybe it's a layperson thing. And so if we talk to folks with law degrees, I was excited about this sample. Sample ended up kind of small though. So then we ran it again with a different sort of expert, people who are hiring personnel. So these are employed adults who work as part of their jobs, as part of their daily activities in doing some sort of hiring, recruiting evaluations. So we ran the same experiment that I showed you before, the same setup to jump right to the results. We see the same patterns. So now even people who are relative experts, people with law degrees who work in discrimination law, much bigger sample people who work in hiring in organizations and are ostensibly trained to some degree to think about this stuff, to look for discrimination. They also see the favoring frame. Well, men fit better. They see that as less discriminatory, even though legally, both logically and legally, it is equivalently discriminatory. In this study with the hiring personnel, we also asked them, as they're looking at the decision, like, could you make a recommendation? Do you think this decision should be flagged for further review? Like, is it problematic? Does it need additional review? And this kind of more behavioral DV, again, we see this favoring frame. If they're not thinking of it as discriminatory, then they don't think it needs extra review, right? So we're kind of not noticing and therefore not acting against. Next, we move to Supreme Court cases. So, we've set up these experiments. I'm a big fan of experiments. I mean, this is SPSP. We don't have to tell you guys this, right? But the control you get, like, that's the gold standard. Okay, but maybe they're a little contrived, something like this. So we moved to Supreme Court cases in the United States as our primary text. And I often get the question, I think it's really interesting, about, well, legally speaking, is disfavoring more illegal than favoring? Again, no, it's not. In the eyes of the law, discrimination law in the United States at present, whether you prefer whites or disprefer blacks or something like this, those are equivalently discriminatory. And many discrimination cases in the case law in this country have actually hinged on favoring preferences. So only selecting whites, something like this, for a favoring reason. So we took these Supreme Court cases, the kind of primary text of the case. We had to whittle it down a bit, right, for our lay audiences here. But here's an example. This is from a Ruth Bader Ginsburg case, actually. Ann Hopkins, a woman, worked at Price Waterhouse for 5 years before being proposed for partnership. The board decided to put her proposal on hold. The next year, the chairman of the board, Jake Phillips, refused to repropose her for partnership. He was sued for this decision because the partnership selection process relied on recommendations by other partners, some of whom openly preferred men. And then in the disfavoring, we took that exact same text from the actual case, right? We just, trimmed a couple words and shortened it. And then the only thing we really changed, though, in a serious way, was this openly opposed women instead of openly preferred men. And in the original case, some of these cases we pulled are actually the favoring frame was the original case. And so we changed it to disfavoring. In others, the disfavoring frame was the original case. We changed it to favoring. What do we see? We see the exact same thing again. So when a case is presenting the exact same case facts, et cetera, when it's presented in terms of disfavoring, we openly oppose women, people are more likely to recognize that as discrimination, as compared to when we say we openly preferred men, as kind of favoring in group love, advantaging. And again, we see this, this recognition or not has an effect. It changes how supportive people are of actually pursuing litigation, of whether the defendant should have to pay damages, et cetera, et cetera. So if it doesn't seem as discriminatory, then we don't need to do anything about it. And so that's part of what's happening here. Often get questions about alternate mechanisms. So in this same Supreme Court study, we ran a series of additional, maybe what else could be explaining this? The intentions measure worked again, same mediation I showed you before, that works throughout all of these studies. That's a one-item measure from a somewhat older paper now. So we also supplemented it with a 6-item moral intentions measure. So this is less how positive, negative your intentions are, and more how good, bad, but very similar in that also mediates the effect. Some cool work by Evan Applebaum and colleagues on intentionality. So how purposeful was the action? People tend to see it as more discriminatory if it's more purposeful. That's not affecting the frame difference here, so that's not explaining it. Some questions too, or are we kind of tapping into prospect theory here, like kind of a loss aversion, like disfavoring is more bad because it's a loss. If so, we would think that would affect people's affect, and we don't see that driving this effect. So this seems like it's really intentions doing the work. We did one more kind of version of this. This time we made it a hiring scenario in which a consulting company actually is hiring and seeking to recruit students. This is a business school student sample, and I'll just note from experience that these students are very eager to get recruited for things that they can get recruited for. So this setup for them was quite compelling. They first read about the company, this consulting firm called Strathmore, and they read about a previous hiring decision. They were, just kind of exposed to this, reading about it. And then afterwards, we asked them how interested they, the student, the participant, were in reaching out to Strathmore, in sending them their resume, in kind of saying, hey, I'd like to work for you. So first, we again replicate this framing effect. They saw the favoring framed decision as less discriminatory. And then on the behavioral measures, this is what I think is interesting. No, this is only marginal, but I still think it's cool, so I want to share it. We asked them if they're willing to upload their resume, right? So think about what that requires. They're like on their laptops. I can't remember if this was during pandemic or pre-pandemic, but right, they're on their laptop. They have to go, they have to get their resume, they have to upload it to a survey instead of just finishing up, right? But here's where we're starting to see this behavioral difference in, well, if the company made a decision that doesn't seem discriminatory, then there's no need for me to punish them. Like, it seems like a cool company. I might as well show my interest. I would like to be hired by them. I'd like to share my resume. If they made the same decision, but it's framed in a way that more clearly communicates discrimination to people, then they're less willing to demonstrate interest. So that was interesting to us. All right, how can we turn this off? How can we turn this off? This seems problematic. It would be nice if we could train people to see that these are equivalently discriminatory, that they result in the same inequality producing outcomes. Following attributions to discrimination model, Brenda Major and colleagues have developed over many years. What we know is that people tend to attribute a decision to discrimination if they see that decision as demographic or based on some sort of identity in some way, and if they see the decision as unjust. So, okay, maybe we can highlight the lack of justice. We can use the fact that in Western morality, or perhaps global morality, victims really play a strong role. Maybe in the favoring frame, we're just sort of forgetting the victim. So if we highlight that, maybe that will fix things. Spoiler alert, it does not fix things. We tried this many times, many times, because we just kept thinking, no, it's got to fix things. Why is this not working? But I'll show you one of the versions. So here we crossed the favoring, disfavoring setup with elaborated thinking or not. So half the participants just went through the study as normal. And the other half were asked to think about, at the end of reading about the decision, how does this affect both candidates? In this case, we use the names Jake and David. The idea here being that maybe in the favoring frame, oh, Jake got picked because he's younger and they fit better with the culture, or I prefer younger people. We're sort of neglecting the victim. And so by reminding people about David's experience, maybe it's going to help make them recognize discrimination. As I said, though, no, it doesn't. We did a few additional checks just to see, okay, why is this not working? Notice how similar these are. I found that really interesting. So we went in and we looked for those in this elaboration condition. What did they write about? Like, were they on topic? Did they just not happen to mention the victim or focus on harm? And we actually found no differences between the disfavoring or favoring conditions. So if you're disfavoring elaborated, you talked about harm to David. If you're favoring elaborated, you talked about harm to David. And the vast majority of participants talked about harm to David in those conditions. So that doesn't seem to be working. Here's my big list of other stuff that didn't work. Elaborated thinking about harm, did that twice. Victim perspective taking, so another way to get into this, hey, favoring still creates victims mindset. That didn't work. A series of informational interventions we tried. So don't think about intentions. We want to think about disparate impact. Also a version where we didn't tell people don't think, we told them only to think about disparate impact. Defining discrimination for people as both favoring and disfavoring. So any of these things. Defining for people, hey, it counted as discrimination if there's an identity criteria involved, if demographic criteria is involved whatsoever. None of these things moved the mean. I should note, this affected people's sensitivity to discrimination. It did not affect the framing effect. So it did not reduce the gap between how we see disfavoring as discriminatory and how we see favoring as less discriminatory. Things that do turn this off. It's really, for us, what we found so far is we've really got to go through intentions. And as I've said many times, we think this has to do with how primary intentions are in Western morality in particular. I keep mentioning Western morality because I think it would be interesting to go into other spaces where intentions don't play quite as strong a role in moral thinking, moral psychology, and see if that might change things. But here, we were able to move this around by messing with intentions. So in this study, the favoring, disfavoring, as I've shown you before, we added a third condition, selfish favoring. So they read the exact same thing. Bosses always felt younger folks fit in better, men fit in better, whatever the group is. And then they read a little bit of extra information. And the boss has been trying to get an award from the Chamber of Commerce Young Leaders Society, right? So now it feels like this favoring that I was doing was sort of a selfish reason underneath, and maybe that can mess with people's intentions. Again, did the study twice, a confirmatory pre-registered after. And we found, finally, what we expected. So disfavoring seen as the most discriminatory, favoring seen as the least discriminatory, but selfish favoring, we're starting to move that a bit, And why are we moving that? It seems to be going through intentions. So the selfish favoring, we no longer see this favoring as, oh, they're just trying to be helpful, they're trying to be nice in group love. We see it as, oh, they're being selfish. They have this ulterior motive, and now we're more suspicious of their intentions, which means we're more willing to attribute the decision to discrimination. So, as I've said, and I'm going to say again, if I leave you with one thing today, what I really hope you remember is that when we're thinking about discrimination, studying these kinds of effects, it does not produce only victims. It absolutely produces victims. That's important. But for every instance of discrimination, there's someone who benefits from that decision as well. There's someone who benefits from that decision as well. And that seems to be missing in our science about these kinds of effects. I'll give you one other example. There are studies, a lot of studies on affirmative action and how beneficiaries or people perceived to be beneficiaries of affirmative action might feel stigma or undermined. And my question is, well, do beneficiaries of traditional discrimination feel undermined and stigmatized? If not, why not? Why not, right? If we're going around benefiting, dominant group members are benefiting from discrimination all the time, what's preventing us from noticing that, feeling bad, et cetera, et cetera? And so that's a general question I have, a lot of ideas about why, but the more particular one is why, as scientists, are we not considering that category of things, how people benefit from traditional discrimination, what that experience is like, whether people notice it, et cetera. So oversight as to what counts as discrimination or what causes inequity, disfavoring versus favoring, may make inequity itself harder to fix. A couple of sites there. You can find the papers on my website. I'm super excited to answer your questions.